Okay, this is just the start of a new video. I think I actually paused the video then, so this will be a continuation of where I just left off a moment ago. Okay, I understand it's a little bit hard to see the overheads, so I'll just make mention of the headings on each overhead, so for the purpose of people when they have the hard copy, they can refer to them. I'm looking at a table now which basically categorises different types of competition and tries to explain when ports will compete against each other. Now the first top left quadrant is what they call the direct competition quadrant. Then we have the coexistence quadrant below that, and then above that we have the collaboration quadrant in the top right corner, and then we have the bottom right hand side, we have the partnership quadrant. I'm quickly going to go through those different quadrants and how cooperation between those quadrants is characterised and how that helps explain in what situations ports will cooperate and to what extent they'll cooperate. Okay, the direct competition quadrant, which is the top left-hand quadrant of that table I just showed. Now in this quadrant, it describes that in this situation, ports that are in this quadrant are classified as ports that are in competition with one another. And in that situation where they're in direct competition, they are less likely to compete with each other. Usually it might be for the same type of container transport to the same hinterland or in the same foreland as well, because they're usually quite geographically closely located. And examples of these could be Singapore and Hong Kong in Southeast Asia, and Hamburg and Rotterdam in Europe, where they are geographically close. They compete directly for the same markets, and hence they generally don't cooperate when looking at this competitive quadrant. The one below that, the box below that, is the coexistence quadrant. Now, ports located in this quadrant provide complementary services to one another, and they often have been described as having niche or demarcated roles. For example, one might be a port that focuses on cruise lines as opposed to cargoes. And in this situation, ports are quite willing to coexist with each other. One, because there may be not as much threat, and because they have different roles. In this extent, they're not competing, but they're not cooperating either. There can be some low-level cooperation, however, in the forms of joint marketing, short-term ventures and so forth, memorandums of understanding, but generally this is fairly low-level cooperation. Examples of these would be Port of Ghent and Zeebrugge in Belgium. Again, they were seen as coexisting. And another historical example of this has been put as being Seattle and Tacoma. That's an interesting one, which I'll come back to, because there's evidence to suggest that these ports that coexist may not be able to do that forever, and Seattle and Tacoma are an example of that. The reason being is that it's seen if you don't cooperate in the competitive environment, you may be left behind. And so a lot of academics think that ports operating in the coexistence quadrant and to some extent the competition quadrant have to be careful, and eventually they'll be forced to cooperate as the competitive tensions seeps in. Then on the top right-hand side, we have what we'll call the collaboration quadrant. Ports that are in competition with each other can cooperate in order to achieve strategic motives. Now, this could be most commonly as things like economies of scale, cost efficiencies, for example, investing in infrastructure, reducing risk by pooling resources together. This is probably the most common way ports collaborate, and it's all to achieve economic goals for the port. So it's in their interest to cooperate in order to achieve these cost efficiencies and therefore compete. So cooperation here is characterised by medium to medium term, short to medium term cooperation in terms of joint ventures that will benefit both ports. Now you'll notice on that diagram I initially put up, I'll go back quickly, you'll see there's some arrows from the direct competition quadrant and the coexistence quadrant up to both the partnership and the collaboration quadrant. Now the reason for that is that often ports, for example, can actually be in competition with each other but cooperate, and that's called a term that's been described as co-opetition. And this is where firms that otherwise are in competition will cooperate with each other where they can both benefit and where they can both potentially better compete against a third party or another port. Now, examples of this cooperation in this collaboration quadrant would be Los Angeles and Long Beach. Do you know how long it's been going for?
5.5 years.
Okay, good. As Los Angeles and Long Beach. Now, these two ports are located literally side by side each other in California, and they do compete for the same market, which is containers, basically. While they are in competition with each other, they do, however, cooperate, and they cooperate on things such as environmental management. For example, they've entered agreements about reducing diesel emissions and particles into the ocean, the speed of ships, how fast they should travel, obviously to reduce emissions around the bay areas. That type of cooperation is quite common in this area where ports compete against each other in other areas. Another example with Los Angeles and Long Beach is where they have actively cooperated in the development of infrastructure. And the best example of that was a development called the Alameda Corridor, which was basically a investment by both ports who put aside several millions of dollars to improve infrastructure from the port to an inland terminal, whereby transport and congestion, in terms of trucks, cars, trains and so forth, would be able to be moved out of the two port areas. Now, it was worth them investing together in this because there was a problem with congestion, and to remain competitive, they both realised it's in their interest to pool their resources, create this infrastructure that will mean that both ports can transport the cargo more efficiently, better, and therefore can compete better against other ports along the North American West Coast. That's one of the examples of a good example of where there's direct competition, but at certain times, cooperating quite extensively works for both ports. And again, that comes back to the fact that ports have to cooperate, particularly if they're in the same geographic area and there are other competing ports competing near them for the same trade. Turning now to the partnership quadrant, which I haven't discussed in too much detail yet. Basically, that's an extension of the cooperation quadrant, but it's an extreme extension. This is where ports are very closely integrated in terms of their strategic planning. That's one example. An example of that is Ningbo and Zhejiang in China, where basically these two ports strategically cooperate to provide a port system, efficient port system for China and the hinterlands around that area. And that's the reason for that is there's been quite a lot of encouragement by the government of China for that to take place. So it's very organised, it's collaborative, it's long term. Another example of that, cooperation in the partnership quadrant, is basically where port authorities merge. And they usually merge in situations where they may have been in competition with each other, quite extensively in competition, but they just can't compete. They're trading off each other, they're limiting their competitiveness, their resources, and they find it harder to compete against other ports within the area that serve the same hinterland or foreland. A good example of this was Copenhagen and Malmö. Can I have a time check, please?
30 minutes.
Copenhagen and Malmö. Now, in this situation, Malmö and Copenhagen were competing against each other, but then all of a sudden a bridge was built between the two, between Denmark and Sweden. As a result of that, all of a sudden the traditional shipping traffic between the two port authorities was going to be eradicated. All of a sudden there was another way of moving freight across a bridge that didn't have to go through the ports anymore. The two port authorities realised we're in trouble here. If we stay by ourselves in isolated with our resources, we're going to die. We're going to lose competitiveness and maybe just not even survive. Therefore, they got together to pool their resources, work collaboratively, not to be in competition with each other, so they could both survive. And it's been very successful, and they've been able to continue to provide a vast array of shipping services to the area. Finally, looking at Seattle and Tacoma. Now, this has been described as an example of where ports have coexisted. However, my view on this, and looking at it, is that these ports actually fiercely compete with each other. They engage, a bit like Los Angeles and Long Beach, in environmental and infrastructure investment together. However, they do actively go after each other's markets for container ships. Previously, Seattle was seen as having a bit of a niche market in cruise liners and commercial fishing, and Tacoma was seen as the cargo port. However, Tacoma continues to try and grab Seattle's market in terms of container ships, and Seattle, likewise, to a lesser extent, has been trying to do that as well. An example of this was 2 years ago when the Grand Alliance between three large shipping companies actually picked up and decided to move their operations from Seattle to Tacoma, which was roughly 20% of Seattle's container trade gone. Now, in these situations, there's been talk of merger, because on the basis that, well, you're competing against other ports such as Vancouver, Los Angeles, yet you're competing with each other. There's two ports 30 k's from each other, competing directly with each other. Why are they doing that? Why are they wasting resources when they should be competing against the other ports further away? But they're just trading off each other, taking each other's markets. There's been a lot of criticism or encouragement that Seattle and Tacoma should merge like that. However, they're seen politically as very separate. Their operations are quite separate. Tacoma may be seen to have a bit more of an advantage in terms of space than Seattle, and therefore they haven't entered into a partnership, and they still are working in the coexistence or the cooperation quadrants. There's some fear out there that unless they do merge at some stage, they may go out of business, but at this stage that's the way it is. So again, this is some examples of just how in the quadrant situations, how ports coexist, how they cooperate, and the reasons behind it. I think I'm out of time, but thanks for your time today. I'm sorry if you can't see the overheads, but I hope you enjoy the presentation. Thank you.